Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 297. I'm delighted to be joined today on the podcast by Dr. Andreas Schlumberger. Dr. Andreas, how are we doing?
I'm all right. Nice to meet you. Looking forward to what we are talking about now.
Yes, no, thank you very much for agreeing to come on. I'm excited for this one, as is my co-host, I know, Jordan Tyra. Jordan, how are we?
Good, thank you. Yeah, looking forward to another one.
Good man, good man. Well, Andreas, we always start the podcast in the same way, just to give a little bit of background on yourself. I know a lot of people will probably be aware of roles that you've been in recently, but do you want to take us on a little journey through your career so far?
Of course, I like to do. So initially I started to study sports science at Frankfurt University in Germany. And yeah, finished off later on with a PhD. So I was able to work as a scientific assistant there with a big focus on strength training research, but performance testing, especially in team sports as well as in individual sports. So this was the start of everything. And after that time, I decided to learn more about how to work individually with athletes. And my feeling was that the best example to do that is to work with athletes in rehabilitation in the case of injuries, because it's a combination of having a specific situation with a specific deficit, the injury. On the other hand, it's the best example of how you work with individual athletes. It's nice to see the laws and the principles, the criteria, and you always have the direct feedback. So that's why I decided to do that and had the chance to work for more than 10 years with a lot of famous athletes in the world. And yeah, let's say finally regarding football, while I always worked over years during that rehabilitation time, part-time in football for Nuremberg Football Club in the first league, then also for the German junior national teams, building up all the fitness department over years from under 15 to under 21. I finally decided then to go the way full-time in football and started then 2011 at Borussia Dortmund with the coaches team of Jürgen Klopp. Went on then with a special rehabilitation focus at Bayern Munich. After my time at Bayern Munich, I had very specific experience as a head of medicine and prevention at Borussia Mönchengladbach in German First League. And after that, there was 1 year at Schalke before joining Liverpool Football Club end of December 2020. Altogether, my emphasis as a sports scientist was always the combination of training, of conditioning, obviously strengths, building up function, and always trying to find the balance between the individual necessities of our athletes and the team approach, which is necessary to build robust and fit players.
Brilliant. Andreas, just to kick off, from your experience, obviously being at the different clubs in Germany and then coming over to England with Liverpool, what are there any key differences between the sort of approach that is happening over in Germany in terms of sports science, and what we do over here?
Yeah, there are obviously a lot of common things, but there are also differences. However you see it. I think special experience in England is obviously the tendency towards being a little bit more scientific is 100% in England. But I think this is already based on the structure and on some types of history. So if you see how English clubs are organized in terms of collaboration with universities, in terms of bringing sports scientists early in terms of internships, doing their PhDs in combination club and university work. So this collaboration between clubs and university is something which is specific, which is also, I would say, related to a lot of famous universities and groups. So like starting early times, Tom Riley at Liverpool, John Moores University, things like that. And I think this is very specific in England and gives sports science a very strong position. I wouldn't say this is not the case in Germany. Obviously, there are also a lot of input by sports scientists. The staffs are bigger than ever, I would say, developing over years. But So the close collaboration with university is, I would say, if single guys do that, it will happen. But it's not like in England part of the system, I would say. This is one of the biggest differences regarding sports and scientific activities.
Interesting. We wanted to talk about pre-season because as we record this, we're going into, I know some clubs have started pre-season already. Some will be going into pre-season over the next sort of couple of weeks. So just to start with, very broad, what's your approach to a pre-season period? What are some of the priorities and how do you go about pre-season?
I think if we consider how to plan a pre-season, it's very important to already plan the off-season, because there's always a relation between how you plan the off-season and how you plan the pre-season. So I think in the case like we have at the moment with the Euros going on, clubs have the chance to give players longer recovery than you have in other years, at least the non-national team players. And I think to use that time, obviously players are active during the off season, but trying to give them enough recovery. And I think this means physical recovery of joints, muscles, as well as mental recovery. And I think this is a very important prerequisite, how you plan effective and efficient preseason. If we enter the preseason plannings, I would say what is very important to be aware of, that what is the most important training stimulus? It's the games. It's the games in pre-seasons already. And I think if you compare former times with more recent times, then I think one of the important developments is that the relation of, let's say, building capacity by training compared to, or in relation to game importance, the importance of the game as the most complex stimulus is growing and growing. And I would say this is one of very important basic prerequisites of a successful preseason.
I'm just going to jump in there, sorry, Andreas, because my first question really is going to be a little bit on like what you touched on in terms of traditionally England. If you go back a couple of years ago, a decade ago, very sometimes they put your boots on. You only trainers, and it's a lot of running, just pure isolated running. And like you just said there, in terms of the conditioning level of the game itself, do you see that as a difference between maybe Germany and English sports science or football? Is that something you kind of have noticed yourself, or is it something you've always thought the games are the way forward, and that's how you think it's best done?
I would say there's finally a big variety. Obviously, let's say the trend tendency that in former times you had a lot more pure running, continuous running, even running in the forest, not on the pitches, but this doesn't matter for me, to be honest. That tendency is very clear, and that let's say modern training approaches regarding, let's say, tactical periodization, to use that term, that tendency is very clear. I think the discussion how important is isolated running, this will go on the next 50 years like it's done the last 50 years. I wouldn't say there's a clear way. As we know from all other sports disciplines, there's so many different ways to the target. So I wouldn't say it's wrong. I wouldn't say something is right. But what I would say is focus on the specifics, on the important things we are trying to focus on. And of course, if we look on how the best teams in the world develop, but also how the next best teams try to develop, the tendency is also clear. We are dealing more than ever with a sports discipline which consists of repeated explosive actions or repeated sprints over the time of 90 minutes plus extra time. And to prepare players for that is somewhat different than saying simply preparing them for having the best endurance capacity. It's not ruled out, but it's not the same. And as long as clubs try to bring in more and more fast players with some specific capacities, it will be always the fight in the body between endurance and speed and repeated speed. And I think to find that balance where there is no clear existing rule is very important. Or let's say in different words, Let's try to keep what the top players of the world have as physical capacities, especially their speed and repeated speed qualities, and don't disturb that by doing too much, let's say, concurrent training stimuli, which might hinder optimal adaptations.
Just on that period.
In general, I wouldn't say running is wrong if we do it at the right times, if we build up, let's say, a chronic load in a progressive and right way. What I wouldn't recommend is to build up chronic load by starting with high volumes of running. Doesn't matter if it's an off season or if it's already in the preseason. I think we can do better things than that.
I was just going to say, Andreas, in terms of analysing a pre-season period, when do you sit back like straight after pre-season when the first game takes place and sort of analyse how the pre-season's gone? Does it happen maybe halfway through the season? Do you get to the end of the season and think, right, how was pre-season? Is there a certain time in the season that you sort of sit back and think about how successful was our pre-season and maybe what changes need to be made, if any, for the next pre-season?
I would say in general, it doesn't matter if it's pre-season or not. To follow a plan is important, and to have the discipline to follow the plan is important. But anyway, you readjust constantly already during the preseason. And I think so to say the most important planning period in football is the microcycle. If it's a week, if it's a 10-day block, if it's a 5-day block based on some specific games, again, doesn't matter if it's preseason or not. That's the most important thing. And I would say readjust constantly after each microcycle is an important part of the quality of what you're doing as a coach's team or physical stuff around the team. And obviously, if you go on, then in the season, I think it makes sense after the first around 3 games to readjust and to summarize how effective, how targeted, how goal-oriented the preseason was, and then already create the idea. But it makes no sense to create then the next preseason to plan it too early, because you have to wait for the dynamics of the season. But I think it makes a lot of sense to start the planning of the new preseason around March, beginning of April. Depend on which team you are working with. Are you able to do some, let's say, late season diagnostics, for example, which is always a good thing if you don't play 3 games a week. And to have already an idea of how effective your training schedule, your training plan, your training scenarios were. And based on that plan, what will be the important parts of the in-season and then, I mean, the late in-season, the off-season, and then the pre-season.
You see so many different approaches to a pre-season. Like I mentioned, some clubs have already, in the UK, they've started back already. Some clubs will start over the next few weeks. And you mentioned before, obviously, the Euros are going on at the minute. We've then got the Olympics, which some players will be involved in as well, and lots of other competitions throughout the year. So this question might be very contextual depending on what sort of position you're in, but the length of a pre-season period, is that something that is kind of taken out of your hands because it falls into the different schedules of different clubs? Or do you have a specific amount of time where you're like, I would prefer to have this amount of weeks to work with players to get them ready for the season?
Yeah, obviously, what we have in modern football, it doesn't matter if we are talking about the best teams or the rest in a league. You always have subgroups in your team. It's the national team players, and you have them more or less in all teams. You have the players who are normal, let's say, starting 11 players, but non-national team players. And you have a subgroup, I would say, it's a little bit more like transition players from the academy to first team, or players who are not, let's say, involved for too long a time with the team. And obviously, it depends a little bit on them. What I want to say is I'm quite relaxed in terms of how we deal with national team players, because if they are more or less competitive around the whole year, it's all about managing them. It's nothing more. It doesn't matter if they go to the Olympics or not. It doesn't matter if the Qatar World Championships are in November, December. It doesn't matter if they come later in the preseason. And look, in most cases, because they also need holiday. If the successful players come back from a competition like the Euros or the World Championships in summer, they have 3 weeks of holidays. So meaning they mainly need to recover. And then you don't have a long preseason for them. It's mainly 2, 3, maximal 4 weeks. So, but sometimes we forget in trying to do all to prepare them for the new season, how much games they played, how game fit they are. So meaning recovery is very important. And then you need to trust your own way, saying, okay, it's not like in former times that I need, or I have 6 weeks of preseason. I have only 3 weeks. So it's how to manage them, to keep them fresh, to bring them back to the loading, to the intensity they need, but don't lose your nerves in terms of thinking you put 6 weeks in that 3 weeks. And always if people try to do that, it's going wrong. And always if you don't lose the nerves and you simply try to do the right things, accept that they don't have a real preseason, but it's not necessary because they played longer. They were more and longer competitive than the others. So meaning they were game fit. There's no necessity to give them a preseason.
So does the priority at that point for a national team player or somebody that's been involved in tournaments become obviously recovery, like you've mentioned, but then also getting the sharpness, I suppose, and getting them up to game speed? Because you're going to want them to go into the next season, aren't you, to be not just accumulated a load of minutes with the national team or whoever it is. You want them to be sharp and ready to perform at the highest level, don't you?
Yeah, of course. But I think it's not my main topic to talk about mental recovery, but ultimately mental recovery and physical recovery, meaning bringing them back into intensity, into sharpness, they are ultimately related. So meaning if the mental preparation of the athlete is bad because after 2 weeks of holiday the athlete feels like I'm not recovered, I'm mentally not recovered, how do you can expect intensity from those type of players? Obviously you can say, okay, they're professionals, they have to, and they want to, obviously, but are they able to? That's at the end depends on us as the staff around to consider also these aspects.
How much does European football, Champions League, Europa League, how much does that affect your pre-season planning? I know you just said about that, how the microcycle is so important. I love that phrase. That the most important thing is the microcycle. How much is that looking when you know you're in a Champions League season next season? Are you as a set of staff going, our pre-season needs to look like this because of the demand of the games?
I think in that case, if we go now away from that subgroup of national team players, because that's simply how it is, and my experience is you never create problems with national team players as long as you don't overload them too much in their much shorter preseason. But talking about let's say the normal guys being able to be prepared for 5 to 6 weeks. Of course, it's very important to prepare them physically, to have the right capacity, to have the right robustness. But I think, having the games as the main stimulus and building the preparation around with having, let's say, priorities in training in terms of having high-speed preparation, having Excel decel based preparation, obviously using strengths in a way that it's balanced towards pitch stimuli, because we always have the problem with concurrent training stimuli. We can't forget that. We can't ignore that. While I'm personally, even in preseason, a big friend of doing strengths totally on an individual basis, because I don't believe in that, even if we are in team sports, that each body is the same. And we have so many different, let's say, physical type of players in the team, so that individualization seems to be really important for me. So that's basically all I think I can talk about in general. Obviously, it's clear from if I talk about priority setting in training sessions like high speed or like acceleration, deceleration, obviously it's playing time, it's building up a chronic load. And I think an important aspect is that you don't start the preseason with the really high volumes, that you give ideally a transition week to bring the players back into the football typical actions, to bring them back to intensity and not to overload too early. This, I would say, is something which is very common in football as well as in other sports. But in terms of optimization of repeated sprint ability for football players, I don't think this is the best approach. And at the end, it depends. I think a coach's team, a staff has to create an idea, has to plan how long we need a preseason. If we feel 6 weeks is better than 5, we have to do that. But to do in 5 weeks a training volume that you think, okay, it must be as high as possible to be prepared for Champions League football, meaning playing 3 games a week. It's possible, but it's a risk of overloading, fatiguing players too early, and you will have the probably negative consequences later on in the season. And there must be a fine balance, I think.
Just looking forward on scheduling and fixtures and the changes in the structure of tournaments that is basically just bringing about more games, essentially, if we look at it overall. Maintaining fitness for players, but then across the squad is going to become very apparent, isn't it? It's going to be a priority. And you mentioned before, obviously, the different groups of players. You've got your national team, your starters, maybe your non-starters, and then your younger players as well that are going to be coming into a first team squad. What's your approach of making sure that everybody within that squad is at the level that they can step in at any time?
Yeah, I would say in general, it's important that you know your players very well. It's important that you are maximally informed about deficits, about big strengths of your players, and you always have an individual plan for them. While it's not so easy to integrate that always in the team setting, that's the basis. So if we have big sport science stuffs, performance stuffs around the players, there's one reason why we have so many staff members around the players, that we can do all what is necessary. If at the end, let's take a simple example, everybody trains the same, why having so many people around? Makes no sense. So I think to have a clear picture of each player, what are the things where this player can improve, that's the basis. How we can integrate it, how we can realize that to do everything we think is the best, and that's a different thing. That's a constant matter of discussion within the coaches team, having time slots for doing that. But I think as long as you have a plan and you're discussing a plan, you can do that. And that's in my opinion the most important thing. So it's clear if we're talking about, for example, high-speed exposure and players are non-starters and they don't get enough of that, they have to do. But it depends on what else they do. So meaning sometimes you can compensate some missing sprint exposure by doing the right strength training work on a given day. If it's the better decision, because the player might be pre-fatigued in some way, and then sometimes this is the better solution. But I'm a big supporter of using that individualized approaches. This can start already in the warm-up. I know if you look at the best teams, obviously that's not very common, but there are a lot of teams doing that. So meaning using the first 20 to 30 minutes of team training like a combination of warm-up and athletic development. But there's big differences in the necessities of the players, as I said. So some need, let's say, some jumping power development training stimuli. Others might need some specific acceleration-based work, however you see these deficits. And yes, there's plenty of time and opportunities to building subgroups in the warm-up or in the athletic parts of training, and to focus on that. I think that's the best thing, as well as in the endurance or high aerobic intensity area, as top-ups after training. So I mean, there's plenty of time to do the right things before or after the main part of a training session, if you have a well-discussed and well-planned concept. I think that's a little bit lost in my experience sometimes in the recent past. This seemed to be a little bit more modern, probably 10 years ago, when, like in Germany, first time sport science got a lot of or was an integral part of coaches' teams. But I think we always have to remind ourselves of that opportunities we have, and not simply accepting, like very often, obviously, coaches want that they say, okay, we have our football training approach and that's everything. Each player gets what he needs in that approach. That's regarding intensity, sharpness, obviously, group action, subgroups within the team, tactical development. Of course, that's 100% true. But there are other things to do around that.
So much context played to player as well, isn't there? Like you've mentioned, in terms of areas to work on, but then you're thinking about position, you're thinking about injury history, you're thinking about, you spoke about the sort of psychological side, like what do they feel like they need to work on, like what's their approach to training on a mental level as well. So there's so much contextually, isn't there, from each individual, which makes sense why they require that.
Yeah, totally agreed.
Jordan, have you got anything else on that, just in terms of fitness throughout the season?
Yeah, well, I mean, just touching on the individualization stuff there, I think Andreas, that was such a good, for anyone listening, certainly sports scientists who take part in warm-ups and things like that, that's golden information in it, because it's very easy for us to go, right, it's warm-up time, everyone together, couple of lines. Like Dave Carolan always calls them the sports science lines, and the cameras, a bit behind the camera on the telly, and the players just go through the motions. You know when players are going through the motions, so utilizing that time as athletic development time, like you say, and you might have subgroups, and that's where I was going to ask a question on integrating young players in, because we saw the impact of that with Liverpool season, last couple of seasons, and how many have had massive impact. Obviously, young players coming through are going to have very different athletic demands to try to match some of what the first team players and players who've been in that environment for a long time. Utilizing those individualized times in maybe warm-ups for young players is going to look very different from your regular starters who are just trying to maintain their fitness levels and strengthen things through the season. So, yeah, I think that was just an amazing snippet of information for a lot of people. And then to follow that on to you, Andreas, how important or what's the biggest challenge would you say with integrating those younger players, from maybe under 23 setups or even under 18 setups who are really highly talented technical players, but you're still trying to, you've worked with the German youth national side as well. How do you help them make that step into the first team? They're really honing their craft. That physical demand to the top level is a big jump in it. So how do you get them there? Big question there.
Yeah, but really important question, and that's the challenge. That's clear. I would say if we go through that question from start of the preseason, there are probably different aspects to consider. The first thing is, normally, and I think that holds true in England as well as in Germany, if you talk about the younger players, and the younger players in the season before didn't play, let's say, mainly with the first team, they probably will start with the second team, with under 21, under 23, probably already 2 weeks earlier than the first team. So I think this is something which helps them to be prepared. Let's say it's a little bit like this transition I mentioned earlier, because if you start 2 weeks building up some chronic load already with the under 21, under 23 team, then you do it also in their intensity, which is quite less than in the first team. So meaning this is really a nice transition. Only thing you have to consider before, don't make their preseason too long, obviously, that's clear. But I think that's a nice transition. In the moment, if they start with the first team, I think it's again not losing the nerves in terms of if they start now with the team in preseason. I would say it's always easier for a young player to start in the preseason if the build-up at the beginning is a smooth one. In terms of intensity, sharpness increases progressively, step by step. That makes it easier for them, easier than, let's say, coming from under 21 in October, if I compare that situation, and everybody is on full physical fitness, and each training session they are doing, at least the high loading sessions, are 100% intensity, and that's then sometimes really hard for the younger players. So that's why I think in general it's easier for them to be integrated in the preseason. But what is also clear, if we know that the younger players, due to their younger training history, have a lot of deficits to work on, 100%, it's not the right time to work on that in the preseason, in the moment when they're trying to get used to the intensity of the first team. I think that's very important to consider. As soon as, let's say, after 6 to 8 weeks, they are used to what the first team is doing. I think then you can go back to that idea also for the younger players, using the individualized approach already in warm-up or after team training. But I think especially in the first weeks when they are integrated in the first team, it's very important to recognize that they are working on a relative higher intensity than the others. This means there's no chance for extra work at that moment.
We have lost Jordan briefly, but we'll keep going, Andreas. He'll be back in a second.
Yes.
No, thank you for tackling that, because I think you've given really good detail in terms of the challenges that are faced throughout the season. The other thing I wanted to talk about was return to play. So getting players back, but not just getting players back, getting them back at the level that is needed. So tying in with what we spoke around fitness. So in terms of your approach to that, in terms of returning players back at the highest level, what's the approach you take to that?
I think regarding return to play, it's important. I like to speak about rehabilitation more than using that term return to play. Don't want to make it too complicated, but I want to say is in the moment, if we're talking about return to play, the focus is on this last phase of rehab and on the reintegration phase mainly. And it's so important to consider the rest of rehab, because all what we are doing with the players from the first day after injury is decisive on how they can be integrated and how successfully they can be integrated later on. Very important. So from that point of view, I think it's very important to remind us of that the start of the situation is the injury. Obviously, it's very modern, especially since sports science and strength and conditioning specialists were entering more and more the rehabilitation field, that they say, okay, we take the game as the starting point. So we're going back from the game, what players need to do, or we're going back from the training load you need to do for first team training. And that's our main consideration where we have the orientation for the build-up of rehabilitation. Obviously, that's not wrong. That's clear. But even if we know or we think we know that in the last 5 to 10 years, for example, the necessities regarding explosive actions or high speed, numbers of sprints, meters in some areas of sprinting are getting more and more. This does not change rehabilitation, in my opinion, because it's the injury which is the starting point you have to consider. From that point of view, I'm a strong supporter of saying we need to have a forward strategy in rehabilitation, meaning starting from the injury and starting from the situation, also the physical situation of an athlete at the beginning of rehabilitation. It makes for me no sense to consider first even if it's the position-specific necessities of a players in a game, and take that as a starting point and go backward from that. I know we have tons of literature where it's all about let's go back from the game, but the probability that you make mistakes because you only try to fulfill your wishes, let's say it like this, is high, because then sometimes you don't consider what is necessary from the injury point of view. And what I want to say is the progressions you can do throughout rehab, they depend on the healing process. They depend on how you improve, but they also depend on which physical situation, if it's imbalances, if it's low chronic load, were leading to the injury. This starting point is so important to consider. And it ultimately leads to the focus. I mean, if I have a bad chronic load of a player, there is enough reason to say he needs, let's say, some type of endurance capacity training, however you do it from a methodological standpoint of view during the rehab. The other thing is, are we talking about an older player? Are we talking about a younger player? Again, it's about training history. And all these aspects define or tell us how we can progress. And it's only until the very, very late phase, in my opinion, where we go backward from what is needed for the team training. Obviously, I'm not arguing against that backward idea, but what is the main goal of rehabilitation? The main goal is that at the end of rehabilitation, you are able to do each single football action in maximal intensity. And it doesn't matter at which team you play. How is the team philosophy? You have more a counter-press style. You have more possession style. It doesn't matter. You need to prepare for that, because if the player is not ready for that, you can't give him to team training back. And the interesting thing is, in all this rehabilitation approach, if you progress step by step like that, you will do simply the right things. If we think that we need to put too much, let's say, football specificity into rehabilitation, a tendency we have clearly at the moment, also based on new literature, on new suggestions in literature. I wouldn't say based on new evidence, because that's still missing. But the problem is, then you will lengthen your rehab. If not, if you try to do the specificity of football actions too early in rehab, you create too much intensity, too much volume, too early, and this is a risk for re-injury. And that's, again, it's so important to find that balance. And we are all trying to be as specific as possible and sometimes forget the basics. And that's something I'm trying to argue for in rehabilitation, because we are still, and I know what I'm talking about, because re-injuries in the reintegration phase are still an ongoing problem. And I don't think we will solve that by trying to integrate more and more football training into rehabilitation, if it's one by one, if it's by creating smaller group training with youth players for the first team players in rehabilitation. There's a lot of clever solutions for doing things like that. But if we do, again, that things too early, while the players is physically not on the level to do that, then there's a high risk of re-injury or of bad performance. So I have a clear philosophy, preparing them physically as good as possible, obviously recognizing the intermittent style of activity in football, but the football specificity starts with the reintegration process and not too much earlier, because it's simply not possible. There's only one exemption. If there is, let's say, that the hope of coaches that a player is able, after, let's say, 6 weeks rehabilitation, only after a few days of training, being able to play again. While this is an inherent risk of re-injury, that's 100% clear, also based on evidence. This is sometimes a necessity we have to look on. We can't ignore that. So in this case, to say, okay, we try to integrate another, let's say, sports science, football-specific phase at the end of rehabilitation, and by that lengthen the rehabilitation by a 4-day block or by 1 week, because due to the team playing 3 games a week, there is no possibility to have that training contents in team training too often. Then you can do that as a solution, but you always have to know then it's less than a team training, because you can't simulate the non-planned actions in football, the fast decision making under constraints of time, of space, and so on. You can't simulate that 100%, even in small group training in rehabilitation.
Really interesting. So would you say that a common mistake then that you see being made during a rehabilitation phase or program is that we are just skipping to that end phase too quickly?
At least there is I would say it's a natural tendency in our modern times where there's a justification where we are so many staff members, not like we are able to make a rehabilitation in long time and so safe like everybody can do. There's a reason why we are all here. And obviously everybody wants to be quicker than the others, not like saying you always want to break the world record in rehabilitation times, but we are all competitive, also staff members, we want to do that. But as a specialists, we should be clear in what we are doing, and there will be rehabilitations where you can do that, but there will be cases where you can't do that. And we have to identify that, and we have to clearly explain why. And yes, the tendency of being a little bit sometimes too early in terms of football specificity, that's clear, but that's due to that fact. Yeah, and we can't ignore that. But yeah, we should be clear, I think. And I also see a risk in doing too early, too much football specificity because you have too many different stimuli in single sessions. And there's also one thing very clear in rehabilitation. You never know 100% if you are on the right way until you go to maximal intensity. And if you do in the submaximal phases too much different stimuli in single sessions, and you create problems which very often come out 7-10 days later, you don't think of the origin of the cause of the problem. If you don't combine too many different things, you always have, let's say, better relation between cause and effects. And I'm trying to argue for that perspective, because it simply makes sense, and experience shows that that's very important. And this is because rehabilitation finally must be so individual. We are not dealing with machines where each same training methodological input is creating exactly the same output. We are talking about different individuals, and we have to consider that. So saying before we know 100% the outcome, that's not honest. And that's something we know, and we have to consider. It's like if you have one successful rehab in one player with a given injury, and you have with the next player the same given injury, and you try to replicate the same, it will be never successful. Everybody can tell you.
Interesting, very interesting. And I think it's fascinating because on the rehab program as well, you mentioned about the speed of returning back to playing. That's not necessarily how we judge a successful rehab, is it? Because we don't know what's happening after that. You just mentioned there sort of delay in judging how well that's been. If we get players back and then they also re-injure, that's unsuccessful, isn't it? So we need, there's a lot of factors that go into having really maximizing that period of a rehab program, isn't there?
Yeah, I think it's a very nice but challenging expectation to say, I want to have to be players at least 1 year of injury free regarding the same injury or related injuries. That's a minimum expectation I have. And obviously there's another time frame after each injury that you could say you have a time frame of 2 to 3 months, which you should consider the reintegration phase. That's at least something we should be aware of within a staff, within a rehabilitation team working with the players. That's nothing you explain to the player or the coaches each day, but you should be aware of that always, if you do the next loading progression in terms of you're playing the first time 90 minutes, that's something new. This creates a different necessity for recovery than for the players who are used to that stimulus. And like that, so this time frame of 2 to 3 months of seeing players as reintegration players, which means we should have a specific focus on them. We should expect that sometimes they need a little bit more recovery than others. The risk and the danger in that phase is everybody knows they were out due to injury, and everybody, and coaches and rehabilitation staff as well, things, but they need more training. But it's so important to fulfill the recovery necessities of them, and again, don't lose the nerves. And that's something which is really, really difficult, because also players want to do more. They want to come back, they want to compete, they want to play more. And that needs a lot of arguing, a lot of explanations, trying to do the right things. Or let's say the consequent things.
That was going to be my question, is how have you faced those challenges with players when you're explaining to them, listen, you're on the back of a long injury, we're reintegrating you, and they think, right, I've played 60 minutes back, I'm fine now, off I go. How have you then kind of, held them back a little bit and kind of helped them understand this is still reintegration?
Yeah, obviously this is most of the time the phase where you are not the best friend of the player. Because obviously they don't like that, but that's 100% understandable. So I always say, if let's say a player did a really professional rehab in terms of being 100% confident, followed everything, but we can expect that. They are simply human beings, so you can't expect it always. So they did everything the rehabilitation team told them. And then they are back, and then they argue, so now I did everything what you wanted from me. Why you try to hold me back, or you still try to hold me back? So it's not about holding back. It's, again, trying to do the right things, and it's not of trying to be overcautious. It's simply to do the right things. I think everybody in a rehabilitation team will be brave enough to do the right things, but also to see the limits is so important. And I think everybody who works in that field knows the situation with single players. So, like I said, in that moment, they are not your friends, but weeks later, they progressed successfully, their performance is back, they scored, there are big parts of team success, and then it's forgotten.
And we're not there to make friends.
Yeah, yeah, no. Finally, of course, it's not that. At least it's not to fulfill wishes of players if there are strong arguments against it.
Yeah, definitely. Andreas, I wanted to finish on one final topic, something that you've touched on quite a bit already. I just want to see if there's anything else you want to expand with, and that's injury prevention. So looking through the season, you mentioned obviously speed exposure. We've spoke a little bit about strength work as well. But where does your focus lie in season on hopefully preventing injuries?
In general, I think that if we, in this case, it's really helpful to use scientific knowledge. So how do injuries occur? They occur typically based on, a multifactorial occurrence. So it's never a single factor which is responsible for a given injury. And that's very important. So this means that also a multifactorial approach to injury prevention, a holistic approach, seems to be very important. So focusing on a single factor, like saying, okay, our most important injury in football is hamstring. Let's everybody doing Nordic hamstring. I don't think this is the most targeted approach. While you can do that, it's only a small part of it. I'm a strong supporter of trying to find the best combination of doing the right things for the movement system of a single player, of an individual, and do that in combination with trying to identify the typical individual loading recovery responses. So this is based on monitoring, obviously. It's also based on subjective observation of players, of communication with players. But I think we shouldn't forget in all our attempt to try to build robust players by increasing step by step their physical capabilities, that injury critical situation in terms of that they are overloaded always occurs throughout the season. So it's so important to identify, like in the reintegration players, when a player is really overloaded and under-recovered. And that's then not the right time to give additional stimuli, to give strength training stimuli, even if they have a preventive effect. And we should consider that not only ticking boxes in terms of did we do our prevention 3 times a week, also saying on some given days we don't do it because the player is already overloaded. How should an additional stimulus help? And the other aspect, like trying to improve the function of the whole movement system, means simply thinking in terms of the kinetic chain of the players. So meaning it's the constant optimization from, let's say, the foot, the ankle joints until the shoulder, neck, and simply considering the weak areas of players, also the areas where they predominantly getting fatigued after games, always consider that and try to find the best combination of physiotherapeutic treatment and the exercises these individual players need to manage their problems. And I'm not too, let's say, too positive about how much we can change players in general. They always will have their weak areas. And I think it's very important to manage that throughout the season and trying to improve the causes of some, let's say, hypertension. They are great sometimes, like in the hamstrings or like in psoas muscle, like in the lower back. But to have a clear plan to work on that, but to have also clear criteria how to assess and make objective if they're improving or not by testing, by monitoring, and so on. And from that point of view, I would say, for me, the perfect injury prevention means, of course, we all do preseason testing, things like that. But In most of the cases, if the player was already in the club in the season before, we know our players very well. So it's more about defining probably, let's say, the next 8 weeks where we try to improve one specific aspect of function that player and retest it in the moment when we think we had 8 weeks of good training for that area. And this is a very, very individual question. And obviously, if it's a little bit more towards performance testing, like strength testing, then it's more difficult to integrate it because sometimes it doesn't fit into the game schedule due to loading responses you have to consider. But at least let's try to plan that. So I see injury prevention, a very, very individualized approach is necessary and based on a very multifactorial approach.
Brilliant. Andreas, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for going into so much detail on every topic. I really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to, is there anywhere you would direct people to just keep up with the work that you've got going on?
Now, I would generally say, from my experience, let's try to keep things simple. That's one thing. Let's try to communicate as good as possible. Nothing is worse than the unspoken word. So simply talk about things we have to talk about and don't think it's not important. And then something happened, bad performance, injury, and people say, oh, but I knew it before. Yeah, but did you say? So meaning communication obviously is really important. And then I would say, let's try to keep the discipline that everybody's doing his main job. So meaning a sports scientist really should love his sports scientific job, his area of working, and shouldn't try to be now the specialist for making medical diagnosis. Even if a lot of this thing is very interesting. Keep this discipline, know what you're responsible for, but also know for what you're not responsible for, because for your non-responsibilities, there are other specialists in the teams, at least in the top teams, because you have big stuff. And I think this is not like saying what we're doing right or wrong. It's simply, it's normal. It's normal for human beings. It's natural that we want to increase our knowledge. And if we are experienced, we want to talk about a lot of things, but keeping that discipline and staying in your field, I think that's a very important recommendation.
Brilliant. Andreas, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. All the best.
So we just wrapped up episode 297. It's in the bag, Jordan. How did you find that one with Andreas?
Yeah, really good. Really, really good. I think, to be honest, I think the podcast has always been really good, but of late, I just feel like the guests we've had on and some of the information we've been getting on is outstanding. Like, genuinely, like, to hear someone who's worked with genuinely some of the best athletes and footballers in the world talking about how they approach working with them on a real individual level, which is really, really good to hear. And also, just we had a little conversation off air there, didn't we? And again, just little snippets where you go, yeah, wow, like that's really, really impactful. And I think for me, like I kind of mentioned on there, there's a few bits which, if you are currently, I mean, it's probably too late to be planning your preseason, but if you're in the middle of your preseason right now or just started it, like when he was talking about integrating youth players, like under 23 players, and we, like I was kind of alluding to, Liverpool have a massive impact with youth players this season when they brought them in and they had great success. And he was talking about bringing them in under 21, under 23s, and under 18s pre-seasons typically start, 1 or 2 weeks earlier, sometimes 3 weeks earlier than the first teams. And he spoke about that kind of soft loading into going into a first team season if they're called up to that in the preseason. I think that's a really good way of looking at it for some.
Yeah.
Well, that was really good. But just, yeah, there's so many bits of information in there. And one thing that really rang true throughout the whole thing was that individualized approach is so important. And he was talking about, yeah, we have big staff and stuff, but we bang on about it all the time, don't we? But that just shows in a top environment, the top practitioners and literally world-class athletes, the individualization, it can never go away. It has to be there, arguably more importantly there than anywhere else. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, it's what the main thing I was going to say, that's the overriding message, isn't it? That individualization. You spoke about it on a rehab basis, and also the fitness side of things as well throughout the season, even into pre-season, like looking at that off season. He spoke about it right the way through. The other thing, which I know some people will have the experience with this, some people might not, is the whole national team players. I thought that was really interesting, but not overloading them, not trying to do too much, making sure they get the right recovery. I know there'll be some people that don't work with national team players, but I think that the message from that is that you're going to have players at different levels of either development, of experience, and they can essentially, that can be your squad split into different groups. So he was talking about national team starters that are non-national team players, and then obviously like younger players or players breaking through into first team. You could relate that to any team, couldn't you? You could have your starting group, your non-starters, and maybe some of the younger players. And I think that's the sort of lesson to take from what he spoke about around that. The other thing was the German and English differences and the more scientific approach over here. And I don't think he spoke too much about the difference in Germany, more than the fact that it wasn't tied in so much with universities. But from my perspective, and you can tell me if you took anything different, my perspective was that maybe it's a little bit more, we spoke about in the community recently on how much of your work is scientific, is based on scientific literature, and how much is actually based on experience, or what sort of ratio is from one to the other. And from what he was saying, this is what I took it, maybe in Germany it's a little bit more led by experience, and here it's a little bit more led by science, which I thought was really interesting. Yeah, I think that was the main stuff for me. The other thing he talked about was the off-season, pre-season blend. So making sure that you're not looking at it as strictly a pre-season period, but actually need to consider what's going on in the off-season. And obviously the level that he's working at, he's got players that aren't having an off-season. Like you look at some of the players that are in the Euros currently that are in that Liverpool team that are going to go in, they're going to have a little bit of time off, but then they're going to be into maybe a little bit of pre-season, then into the season. So it's all just blending into one, isn't it? But again, the overriding thing is knowing each individual, knowing what they're at, knowing what they've done, what they need at the right time, and going from there, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it just highlighting on the kind of off-air conversation we had at the end, the psychological element of doing the right thing at the right time. And he mentioned a very high-profile player, I don't want to mention the name, but he had a conversation with that he worked in Germany, and he said, you know, I want to be the fittest player, the competition player with Andreas, but if you give me one game off or rest me for the right games throughout the season, you'll have me for the whole season. And that's from a physical but also a mental point. And the question I kind of asked him was about winter breaks and stuff. It's always one of those, and I remember when Jurgen first came to Liverpool, and he was surprised that we didn't have winter breaks here. But Andreas said, you know, he's done both models in Germany. They had a winter break that used to be a lot longer than it is nowadays, but in England, obviously, we never had winter break, and we just go full on. And that's always been a fun thing in the community, hasn't it? When we talk about that with international members in the WhatsApp group, saying, "I can't believe you guys don't have a winter break," and we pack 3 games into sort of 7 days. But he was saying how the actual mental side of that is probably more than the physical side of it. Just giving that, because these guys are playing at the top level, you know, there is no room for error. And just actually, if you think about the impact of long seasons with Euros, you know, with other tournaments happening before that, the mental capacity that requires to then have little snippets of rest and break. And his words were, you know, actually just giving them one extra day off in the week, the huge impact that has on players. Physically, yes, definitely, but mentally, what he thinks is huge. So, yeah, I think he raises. We've been kind of bringing this topic up a lot, really, haven't we, in terms of fixture congestion and, you know, how we best prepare players, how we're looking after their well-being more and more and more. And I think it adds more fuel to the fire. It's certainly, in my opinion, that fixtures are getting a bit too heavy, and how we best preparing players now for these long seasons. So it'd be really interesting off the back of the Euros. I think we're in a great time to kind of talk about this and then see what's going to happen, you know, going forward into the season ahead. So yeah, brilliant episode overall. I love that. Really good to be part of that one.
Yeah, I think that that mental side was really, really interesting, and that relates to anyone, doesn't it? If you're going into a place of work every single day, like regardless of how much you love going to that place, you need a little bit of separation as well. And he mentioned as well about working with the same people, the same group of players, the same group of staff. It's not unnatural for you to just want a little bit of time back away from them to then refresh and then go back in. So it makes complete sense. So no, I thought there was absolutely loads in this one. It's definitely one that you need to go back through and make notes on and jot down some of the things that he was talking about, because I've made absolutely loads of notes on different things that he was saying and just drawing from his experiences at these top clubs. So yeah, I really appreciate him coming on and you for joining me again, mate. Big yeah, I really appreciate giving up your time. The final thing, like always, make sure you show some love to our sponsors. We're welcoming back Magic Mind, so go and give Magic Mind a follow. Perfect tool for productivity. I know you like being productive, Jordan, so a bit of Magic Mind in the morning, it helps you out. Also Rezzil and Hytro and the Good Prep as well. I'm off to have a good prep meal right now to fuel myself, ready for performance. So yeah, make sure you go and check all the sponsors out. The links are in the show notes. And Jordan, thank you again, and bring on episode 298.
Here we go. Getting near that 300 mark now, aren't we?
Big plans for that. Keep an eye out. Thanks, Jordan.
No worries.